Hello, and welcome to Distant Echoes, New Mexico episode 28, The Apache Revolt. Last time we reached the end of our first section of the sub-series talking about the history of the Comanches. Today we'll continue with one more of New Mexico's neighbors, the Apaches. Specifically, this will mostly be about the Spanish strategy for trying to contain the Apaches and bring them into the Spanish fold. We'll be talking about what parts of those strategies worked and how those could have been applied to other groups around New Mexico and what parts didn't. Finding a good overall history of the Apaches has proven to be a bit of a challenge, so I'll mostly be focusing on what I could find from the period roughly from 1795 to the early 1800s. With all those disclaimers out of the way, let's jump right into it. Exactly what the origins of the Apaches are is a bit murky, like many of the nomadic and semi-nomadic tribes around New Mexico. Even the origins of the word Apache are a little unclear. What is known is that they speak an Athabascan language, which means they probably have some connection to the Navajo and came maybe around the same time. But exactly when they arrived in the Southwest compared to the Navajo is unclear. All of the groups of the Apaches range from roughly the mountain ranges of western New Mexico and Arizona all the way to the coastal prairie of Texas. Over time, the bands that range in these areas would begin to develop distinct characteristics that would differentiate them. The ones we'll be mostly talking about today are the Mescaleros, which are unique among these differentiated groups of Apaches in that their zones of travel tend to encompass both the mountains and the plains, which is a little bit different than a lot of other Apache bands. Much like the Navajo, the Apaches would also pick some form of agriculture to help maintain their food supply. That's kind of what we talked about during the Comanche episodes, the Comanches that allowed the Comanches to defeat them when the Comanches started expanding onto the southern plains. But it was still an augmentation and was never really the main food source of their diet. While there was likely conflict between the Spanish and the Apaches from early on in Spanish excursions into what would become the American Southwest in northern Mexico, it really wasn't until after the Pueblo Revolt that violence began to climb significantly. Part of this increase in conflict was due to the Spanish actions of trying to more strongly assert themselves over the people that surrounded them. During the early years of the 1700s, many other groups, such as the Humanos, would also be absorbed into the Apaches, which would increase the number of people that the Spanish were calling this and the number of people that the Spanish may be having violent encounters with that they would then claim was Apache violence or violence towards the Apaches. So kind of real quick going over all the different groups of Apaches we may talk about. So you've got the Lipan, the Lipayan, the Jicarilla, the Llanero, the Ferroan, the Natage, and the Mescaleros. Those are all your east ones located kind of in the eastern part of the range. Around the Gila Basin, you also had the Gileño, the Membreño, and the Chiricahui. And the Chiricahui would become the Chiricahua under the more modern designation. Even further west in central Arizona were the Tonto and the Coyotero, also known as the White Mountain Apaches. And when I use the term Mescalero in this podcast, that will be referring to the Mescaleros, the Natage, and the Ferroan, because those would kind of combine into what is the modern day Mescalero Apaches. The Apaches were able to develop a combined economy, so they would hunt buffalo for part of the year on the plains and gather mountain plants in the other portion of the year. After the Pueblo Revolt, they expanded thanks to being able to obtain Spanish horses, which, just like everyone else who obtained horses around this time, it allowed them to move over greater distances and move more quickly. The Apaches as a whole would begin to dominate the plains starting in the early 1700s. However, as we talked about, the Comanches would push them out of the plains and push them further south. Driven out of the plains where the buffalo were plentiful, they began to rely on raiding the Spanish for sustenance. Horses quickly became the primary target of these raids, as that would allow them to continue to raid for food when it was needed. Overall, kind of one of the things that would cause a lot of issues between the Spanish and the Apaches that the Mescaleros believed that killing of one of their own demanded retribution in kind. Anyone that could be lumped in with the other could be retaliated against to get this retribution, though. And the Apache raids on Spanish belongings gave the Spanish a justification to set out on slaving raids against the Apaches. This would result in a cycle of violence where one side would attack the other, and the other side would then demand some kind of retribution, whether that be the Spanish trying to go reclaim the goods that were stolen or the Apaches trying to get retribution for their own killed. And each time, the violence would then just escalate, as now the side that had been attacked would need to get their own retribution in kind. The Apache raids would in time reach as far south, though, as Zacatecas. During wars with the Comanches, the Apaches would seek shelter with the Spanish. However, these attempts, when they did lead to attempted settlements or other forms of accommodation would often flounder, with the Apaches leaving and returning to raiding. This would lead to a general opinion among the Spanish that the Apaches could not be trusted when they made such deals. When there were other crises as well, other than the wars with the Comanches, the Apaches would seek aid from the Spanish, promising conversion or settlement in exchange for Spanish concessions. Often they only upheld their end of the bargain just long enough for them to recover before they returned to their previous way of life. By 1772, Presidio commanders were explicitly forbidden from making peace with the Apaches when they came looking for this kind of peace. Starting in the 1770s, Spanish policy began to focus on defeating the Apaches militarily. This is all part of the Bourbon reforms that we've kind of been setting up throughout these past few episodes. In 1773, the Spanish began to deport captured Apaches from the frontier, mostly sending them to Spanish holdings in places like Havana. In the late 1770s, the Apaches again came seeking peace with Commandant General Teodoro de Croix. Croix decided he would accept peace if the following terms were accepted by the Apaches. They would settle in permanent villages near Spanish settlements, they would adopt agriculture, and the Apaches would serve as scouts and auxiliaries. All in all, he was willing to spend a lot for this peace. The Lipan would be the first to test this new plan in 1778. The Lipans that did take this deal, though, would eventually renege, and Croix would soon begin to try and divide different Apache groups against each other. In 1780, they tried the experiment again with the Mescaleros, who had helped fight against the Lipans. Due to various reasons, the experiment was rocky. The Spanish had trouble keeping the Apaches on these peace establishments that they would kind of these settlements they would establish full time, as the Apaches still needed to return to the plains to hunt the buffalo. Many of the forays these Mescaleros assisted with were against other Mescalero bands, and fighting against their kinsmen may have increased tensions and caused some of the Apaches to leave the reservations. Either way, by March 1783, they had all departed. The Conde de Galvez, Viceroy of New Spain from 1785 to 1786, had been exposed to French and English strategies of dealing with indigenous tribes and came to believe that trade was a key factor in control of the tribes on the Spanish frontier. He argued, quote, "A bad peace with all the Indian nations who may ask for it will be more beneficial to us than the efforts of a good war," end quote. He held a special ire for the Apaches, though. Quote, "I am very much in favor of the special ruination of the Apaches, and in endeavors to interest other tribes and even other Apache bands in it, because these Indians are our real enemies in the interior provinces," end quote. His policies were nothing new, though. It was, per Max Moorhead, a, quote, "highly sophisticated, brutal, and deceptive policy of divide and conquer, and of peace by purchase, of studied debilitation of those who accepted it, and extermination of those who rejected it," end quote. It was your standard strategy of divide and conquer. Take those who were going to make peace and bring them into the Spanish fold, and make them dependent on Spanish goods so they could not leave the reservations, and crush those who did not until they either complied or were dead. Galvez also divided the interior provinces into 3 distinct commands that were fairly independent of each other. Each of these 3 divisions was allowed to pursue its own policy with regard to the Apaches, and this will cause problems in the future, as each of these commands would have conflicting policies. In 1786, Galvez would suddenly die, and this would leave the overall future for Spanish policy in regard to the Apaches in question. Winter 1786 was a rough year and saw many Mescalero rancherias on the brink of destruction due to Comanche and Spanish attacks. Prolonged frost and a drought also damaged their crops. In 1787, 8 Mescalero leaders negotiated terms with the Spanish. The deal was the same as the last one, with the only adjustment being the flexibility that allowed the Spanish to adjust the terms slightly due to the number of people they were dealing with. Many of these leaders were the same leaders as in the 1778 experiment even. The Mescaleros had their own demands this time, though. No permanent settlements, return of their captured kinfolk, no principal chief, and for the Spanish to issue rations. The Spanish would hammer out a compromise in the end, though. No villages as long as they stayed in clearly defined areas, a mutual prisoner exchange, no more raiding, and the Mescaleros would help the Spanish fight those who did not want peace. The Spanish were to also provide escorts to the buffalo hunts. Other Spanish actions to the east, though, were already working to undermine this tentative peace. To the east, Colonel Juan de Ugalde set out on campaign. He would end up attacking those the Spanish had worked a peace out with. When the Spanish in one of the departments to the west tried to stop him, he basically told them to pound sand, and he was going to continue to pursue his hostile policy towards the Apaches. 4 of the 8 leaders would leave as a result of these hostilities. Of those who remained, they lost many of their followers. Ugarte, the leader in the west, tried to establish a reservation, and 150 Mescaleros did show up. Ugarte understood that this was only a faction, and contained none of the influential leaders among the Mescalero Apaches, though. This peace would, obviously, fail, and the Apaches would rise up and raid the area. Thus incensed, the Spanish viceroy would demand even harsher offenses in 1788 and 1789. There would be another attempt by Apache leaders for some form of a peace, but Ugalde had his men seize them while they were parleying at Santa Rosa. Overall, the Apaches suing for peace would this time be turned away, which only caused the violence to increase. In August 1789, Ugalde set out to crush the Apaches with 522 soldiers in a fruitless search. Ugarte was setting out on his own expedition at the same time in September. Antonio Cordero y Bustamante was chosen to lead this expedition due to his frontier experience. Commandant General Pedro de Nava would be chosen by Charles IV and his ministers for command of the western interior provinces. As the eastern commander, Ramon de Castro, had been delayed, Nava was to inspect both halves of the interior provinces. He found the east to be a place of more raiding than the west due to Ugalde's policy of no quarter with the Apaches. And in 1791, he was able to convince a group of Lipans to sign a peace treaty. Overall, Nava was hoping it would entice more Apaches to come to peace. If not, the Lipans would serve as support troops to bring the rest to heel. Overall, the system that Nava was trying to set up worked like this. If there was a Mescalero raid nearby, the Spanish would tell the Captaincio, which is what the Spanish called the leaders of the bands of the peace settlements, that he was to supposedly warn the Spanish, and he would come up with some way to absolve his people, and sometimes they'd even turn over the wrongdoers from within their ranks. This round of reservations would still not be free from problems, though. Soon all those staying there left and slowly would start to return. Presumably they had gone on their yearly buffalo hunt and to collect mescal. This leave and return would become a pattern the Spanish would just have to tolerate. It was really the only thing that was workable. The Mescaleros would also bring their complaints to the Spanish when they had some, and sometimes the Spanish would act on them, sometimes they wouldn't. The proximity of the Mescaleros de Paz, which is what the Spanish called the reservation Mescaleros, and those outside of the Spanish fold proved to be the issue that the Spanish were just never able to overcome and would cause so many problems. The two groups constantly interchanged and violated the terms of the peace, which would just increase tensions between the Apaches and the Spanish. Sometimes it was those among the Mescaleros de Paz that would raid the Spanish, and sometimes it was those outside. But at the end of the day, there was no real way to tell the difference between the two groups. To try and avoid confusion and misidentification, the Spanish ordered that all Apaches be identified by their Apache name and not the one the Spanish had given them. This occurred with mixed success, while some would continue to be called by their Spanish name. Overall, though, those that did become Mescaleros de Paz did seem to engage in acceptable conduct to the Spanish, although there was occasionally things like trade with those outside the Spanish fold that caused heartache between the two groups. Comandante Nava came to believe the best path forward on Apache policy was concentrating the Apaches in reservations. In April 1791, he finally assumed full command. He had no doubts that the peace establishments were only used by the Apaches when it suited them, but they do seem to have helped break the cycle of raiding and counter-raid to some degree. However, in the east, Castro emerged from an altercation that left him wounded, convinced the Apaches should be exterminated. He had agreed to meet with several Lipan headmen to discuss peace, but only one showed up, and he would take that one and his men hostage. The headman and two men would escape. When confronted, the rest would attack, and this ended up wounding Castro in the altercation. Due to this, and Castro asking for too many men, the viceroy came to believe, perhaps unfairly, that Nava was better suited to deal with the Apaches. This led for the viceroy to advocate for Nava's policies over Castro's. Nava soon came to believe he could forge a lasting peace with the Apaches, but he failed to consider that the Apaches would seek alternatives. Quote, in reality, both the Spaniards and the Apaches were performing an interrelated balancing act at the peace establishment, treading the fine line between a bad peace and a good war. Should unforeseen circumstances affect either one of them, the whole system might collapse. End quote. During 1793 and 1794, many Apaches began to grow dissatisfied with the peace establishments, especially when the Spanish altered the terms on them. These changed terms were mostly the Spanish reducing the places the Apaches could go to get rations. This was mostly intended as a cost-cutting measure, because then they had fewer people they had to pay to distribute the rations to the Apaches. Overall, the small irritations like this may have escalated tensions, and increasingly even the Mescaleros de Paz were seeing war come to the fore as the only valid option left for dealing with the Spanish. The raids and counter-raids would continue into the end of 1794, and the Spanish, in their turn, would respond with disproportionate force for these relatively minor raids. However, they weren't always able to meet the demands of this. Financial cuts due to a war with France during this period would put strain on the Spanish's ability to support the reservation system. In Nueva Vizcaya specifically, an entire underground economy existed to move stolen livestock. Both the Apaches and Spanish thieves, which the Spanish would call amigos, used each other for their own gains, either trying to blame it on the other groups or trading between each other. By early 1795, a growing number of the Mescaleros de Paz were done with the Spanish. Calls for large-scale raiding to right Spanish wrongs was increasingly being accepted. And the Mescaleros de Paz were joined by their independent kinsmen in these calls. There appears to have been a division among the Mescaleros de Paz, though, with some captaincios joining plans for raiding and some not. Quote, the atomized nature of Mescalero society and the limited authority of their leaders allowed many rancherias to have it both ways, with some members raiding and supplying food and horses, while others could honestly tell the Spanish that they and their people had not been involved, end quote. And this problem of kind of fluid movement between being a Mescalero de Paz and not would prove another insurmountable issue, which again is all just part of that problem of having these one group of Mescaleros that were living separately from another group, and both groups receiving different treatment as a result. But by July 1795, they were ready. A significant number of Apaches, perhaps as many as 500 in total, began to converge in the mountain ranges between San Elizario and the Presidio del Norte. Around this time, these Apaches would have 2 encounters with Spanish troops, both of them ending in crushing defeats for the Spanish. I don't want to get bogged down in all the details of the war, as it only tangentially involves New Mexico, beyond the kind of the larger strategy the Spanish employed. The Spanish would retaliate, sending Antonio de Cordero out to punish the Apaches. And overall, the greater strategy Nava envisioned was a 3-way pincer from Nueva Vizcaya, New Mexico, and Coahuila, centered on the Sacramento Mountains, the key core portions of Mescalero territory. Nava would struggle overall, though, to explain this conflict to his superiors. His seeming lack of short-term success would cause friction between him and the viceroy. Despite its nominal independence, the Commandant General and the Viceroy still had to cooperate to some degree, as the Viceroy would do things like help move troops through to the frontier, as well as money and other various supplies through the empire. Nava also knew that despite the fact the Spanish settlements weren't struck initially, it was going to be a problem. Overall, he anticipated the Apaches to strike them wherever the Spanish were most vulnerable. To preempt this, he was determined to strike the Apaches where they felt most secure before they could start striking Spanish settlements. Furthermore, he wanted to strike when their food supply was at its weakest. This would be late fall and early winter. His plan was a total war to destroy their warriors and their ability to feed their families. It was widely known that in this late fall and early winter is when the Mescalero Apaches made their annual hunt to the plains, and that was crucial to their survival. He also knew that they needed a large number of people to be able to defend off Comanche attacks to actually make this hunt. If the Spanish could disrupt this hunt, it would force them to make peace or starve that winter. By January 1796, while the Spanish had met with some successes, overall the war was still ongoing. They had killed or captured nearly 150 Mescaleros, and those leaders identified as having started the revolt, though, remained unpunished, and the Mescaleros de Paz remained sullenly aloof to openly hostile. Nava created a modified list of directives on how to fight the Apaches. This list of directives had been created as early as 1793, and he had been adjusting it since to really hone it in. The Spanish continued to intensify their war effort. The detachments from Nueva Vizcaya and Coahuila were to continuously be in the field beyond the frontier, really never giving the Mescaleros a chance to recover from any of the attacks. The Spanish were also going to establish defensive units around the Bolson de Mapime, a key point for Apache raids. There was not to be peace unless Spanish terms were accepted without condition. The constant Spanish harassment did bring some Apaches to negotiate peace. Those that did try to talk peace may be threatened by other Mescaleros, however, and this would cause them to sometimes withdraw from these peace talks. Raids would continue despite Spanish making some gains in early 1796, and as a result of Spanish violence, the raids would continue to increase in severity. The violence would spread into Nuevo Leon, a province which was actually controlled by the Viceroy and not by the Commandant General. This would continue to pressure Nava to explain why he wasn't able to contain the violence. And the truth of it is that the frontier was too large for him to completely contain the violence, and overall the raids were increasing because the Mescaleros and other Apache groups the Spanish were fighting with in this time were being pressured due to this constant military action. The Lipans overall, though, would tend to stay on the Spanish side over their traditional allies, the Mescaleros, during this time. And Nava was able to start cultivating alliances with others against the Mescaleros. Nava would continue the policy of taking captured Apaches and deporting them to Cuba or the island of Hispaniola. Those that survived the deportation would never be able to return to their homeland. By fall of 1796, Cordero sent an expedition to sweep the border region between Coahuila and Nueva Vizcaya, and the goal was again to disrupt the buffalo hunt. By the end of 1796, the situation was still not resolved. From a bad peace and a good war, quote, despite the violence, the loss of life, and the disruption of their hunting cycles that the Spanish had unleashed upon the Mescaleros, it seemed to commanded General Nava and his officers that they were either unwilling or incapable of curtailing their propensity for raiding. The atomized nature of Mescalero society made it almost impossible for any of their leaders to control the actions of their diverse and independent people, and all but ensured that attacks for revenge and gain would never cease. Whether or not Pedro de Nava and his commanders knew or even cared about the intricacies of Mescalero society had by now become irrelevant. In the end, the Mescaleros would either make peace or they would be destroyed. It had come down to that. End quote. The British capture of Trinidad sent shocks to the Spanish world, worrying Spanish leaders that a strike could be imminent from anywhere. An invasion by the British of the internal provinces from the east, west, or north became a serious threat that would be hard to balance with the ongoing hostilities with the Apaches. But by 1798, the Apaches were starting to surrender rather than flee battles. Rather than end with a bang, though, the war would fizzle out. By 1799, the Spanish were having trouble finding any Apaches on their patrols, and by the end of that year, the war was over. In 1800, smallpox ravaged the peace establishments for those Apaches that had come to the table at Presidio del Norte, and the Spanish would struggle again to help the Apaches de Paz to survive. Overall disease and death followed those who had submitted to the Spanish rule, but they had enough to eat, which, for now, was enough. Quote, the desperate conditions of El Carpintero and his companions at Presidio del Norte during the first half of 1800 provided a clear indication that many Mescaleros were willing to acquiesce to the relegated lifeways imposed by the dictates of a bad peace. The situation also reflected how the Spaniards had waged a good war with ruthless efficiency. Although they suffered a stunning pair of initial defeats by relying on professional leadership and a centralized quartermaster and commissariat, the Spaniards were quickly able to regain and maintain the offensive initiative. Through 4 years of war, the forces of Pedro de Nava had clearly been able to reassert their military superiority over the Apaches. Indeed, this had been achieved fairly early on in the conflict, and had been accomplished with relative ease, mainly because the Spanish had been able to launch centrally planned and coordinated operations, a feat the Indians could almost never achieve. Man for man, the Mescaleros may have been more than a match for the soldados, but the Spaniards' command and control proved insurmountable. With a strategy conceived by Pedro de Nava and executed by competent officers such as Antonio de Cordero, the Spaniards methodically and aggressively invaded the Mescalero heartlands, with forces operating mainly from Nueva Vizcaya and Coahuila. These invasions achieved maximum effect by attacking during late fall and early spring, when the Indians were poised to enter the Llano Estacado on their twice-yearly buffalo hunts. By striking at the Mescaleros' primary means of feeding themselves, the Spanish victory was inevitable. They added to their effectiveness by sending out smaller assaults during other times of the year, and by encouraging the Comanches and other nations of the north to attack the Mescaleros whenever possible. Nava and his men also ably employed a divide-and-rule policy with other Apache groups, especially the Lipan and Lipayanes, to use them both overtly and covertly against the Mescaleros. Finally, the policy of deporting captured Apache prisoners of war from the frontier made brutally clear to the Mescaleros that they would not be able to recover their captives or engage in negotiations for exchanges as they had in previous years. In effect, the Spaniards unleashed all the power and subtleties available to a modern nation-state against a tribal society. While the war allowed the Spanish to decisively reaffirm their military superiority, for the Mescaleros the conflict proved an unmitigated disaster. Over the course of 4 years, the unrelenting Spanish invasions into their lands across the Rio Grande pushed these Indians further and further toward the brink of destruction. Breaking up into ever smaller contingents to avoid being discovered by the Spanish became an untenable strategy. The smaller parties might escape detection, but they lacked the solidity necessary to successfully venture onto the plains of the Llano Estacado, where they needed to simultaneously hunt buffalo and repel any potential Comanche attacks. Unable to provide security for their families, the Mescalero rancherias were given the choice to either seek accommodation with the Spaniards or to risk capture and death at the hands of their enemies. For many, agreeing to settle in peace establishments near Spanish presidios was the best option. By the late spring of 1800, between 250 and 300 Mescaleros, including about 85 warriors, had established themselves outside 5 presidios in the province of Nueva Vizcaya. These included approximately 45 at Presidio del Norte, 15 at Guajaquila, 45 at Coyame, and 55 at Cerro Gordo. The largest contingents by far was that administered from Presidio San Elizario, with 185 Mescaleros residing alongside approximately another 100 Chiricahuas. A number of these Mescaleros may have been among those deemed loyal at the beginning of the war in 1795, but many of the captancillos listed by the Spaniards had different names. Greatest change appeared the peace establishment administered outside Presidio del Norte, where at the beginning of the war, there may have been as many as 800 Mescaleros. 5 years later, there were fewer than 50. Though the diminution in Mescalero numbers at the peace establishments clearly reflected that many still chose to live in freedom beyond the pale of Spanish control, another more immediate cause was the extremely high number of casualties they had suffered. Over the course of the war, between August 1795 and the end of 1799, the Mescalero had lost more than 700 men, women, and children, killed or captured and deported from the frontier. The mortality rate of the latter group was very high, and the majority of those shipped out in colleras never returned to their homelands. The estimates of the Mescalero population as a whole during this period range from 3,000 to 5,000 persons. As such, the losses they endured during 4 years of conflict may have approached a staggering 1/4 of the population. End quote. And despite this large war, at least on the Mescalero part, at the end, very little had changed. The peace establishments were still essentially the pre-war status quo, and over time, again, the Apaches would use these as they saw them benefit them, rather than using them for Spanish gain. And so in the end, really, the Spanish spent 4 years and killed nearly 1/4 of the Apache population to achieve pretty much nothing. If you enjoyed the show, please share it with your friends. Leave a review on your podcast app of choice if it lets you. Since I'm a Luddite and don't use social media, word of mouth and reviews are the only way the show spreads. We have a website located at engineeringfire.org. That's spelled ENGINEERINGFIRE.org, where I have a link in the header for podcast resources, including pictures, companion posts, my bibliography, and the transcripts of each show. We have an email you can submit comments and questions to at michael@engineeringfire.org. The intro music is Desperados by Frank Schroeder and sourced from filmmusic.io. The outro music is NeoWestern from Kevin McLeod of Incompetech. Links to all things mentioned are present in the show notes and at the website. Thank you all so much for listening, and I will see you in the next episode.